I'm speaking to you from Ankara, but I'm not speaking from a cafe. That's just my virtual background. Today, we'll be discussing the recent, or maybe not so recent, migration crisis between Turkey and the European Union. I'm saying not so recent because it was in another age before the pandemic, but it was just a few weeks ago as well. Our speakers are Özgehan Şenyuva, who is Professor of Political Science at the Middle East Technical University here in Ankara. Hi, Özgehan. And we have Jessica Bither, who is Migration Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Özgehan had recently written a piece as part of GMF's ongoing On Turkey series. I think you all received it. I hope many of you have had time to read it as well. So to give you a very brief background, we will be discussing based on the events between February 27 and March 18, the first date being when Turkey announced that it would open the borders with Greece for migrants who voluntarily would like to go to Europe, and then March 18, when Turkey reclosed the borders officially in response to the COVID pandemic. In the interim, Turkey actually funneled thousands of refugees to the border. So there were quite a few weeks when the border was packed with people, and Greece presented a very firm stance against the people who would like to pass the border, and the European Union as a whole stood with Greece. So I will discuss with, let's say, I will start with discussing what was the motivation for Turkey to open the border, and then what was the motivation for the European Union to take such a firm stance. And we'll start with Özgehan. Özgehan, please tell us in 5 minutes or less why the Turkish government took such a step. The floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I hope you are all safe and sound in these difficult times. And it's good. Thanks for organizing this. It's good to see that, you know, it's not only about the disease, but life continues and we continue discussing. Now, Özgür, the issue you raised is important, and I hope people had the time to look at the opinionette on the On Turkey series. But let's clarify, start with a clarification. Most of the reporting about the refugees rushing, or the people rushing to the Greek border, mentioned them, referred to them as Syrians. But the evidence on the field, the journalistic experience, or the people who were doing research among those people indicated that they were not 100% Syrians, although Turkey is hosting about 3.6 million Syrians under temporary protection. This was not a rush of the Syrians to the borders, it was other nationalities as well. What the reports from the field indicate is there were a lot of people from Afghanistan or people with Afghan origin coming as well. Now, if you are not familiar with the refugee and migrant scene in Turkey, Turkey hosts, yes, 3.6 million people from Syria, but there are about 300, 400,000 people coming from other countries. And these are stranded in Turkey. That's the word. And most of the people that rushed to the border are estimated to be these people who are stranded in Turkey. Let me elaborate very quickly for those who are familiar with the refugee issues. I'm not an expert on refugee issues. I look more at the political aspects of the refugees in Turkey. Turkey has a geographical limitation, which means an Iranian or an Afghan person coming to Turkey and recognized as a refugee cannot remain in Turkey as refugee and has to go through a very difficult process of resettlement. And the resettlement figures are very, very low. I mean, in the op-ed, there are the official statistics of UNHCR and the Turkish Directorate of Migration and Refugees. In 2019, it is estimated that only 10,000, 15,000 people are resettled to third countries that accept them as refugees. So they are stuck in Turkey, they are looking for a way out. And the moment that Turkey announced they will not stop people rushing, there was this influx. We can elaborate more on this, but we have to clarify that they were not all Syrians. Most of the Syrians actually were cautious about such a passage, and they operated differently. On the second part, why such a decision was taken, again, for many, this was seen as a surprise, but for people who are following the issue closely, this was not a matter of if, but this was a matter of when. President Erdogan and ministers have been signaling that the pressure of having these people in Turkey, having 4 million refugees, migrants, plus the irregular migrants. Just keep in mind that in 2019, Turkey apprehended around 45,000 people, 90% of whom were from Afghanistan and other Asian countries. So Turkey is also attracting a lot of irregular migrants, trying to use Turkey to pass to other countries in Europe. So this is creating a lot of pressure in the public opinion. Now that's my area of expertise. Every opinion poll you look, Syrians are there, and it's negative. Turkish public is very uncomfortable with the amount of Syrians in Turkey. They are very uncomfortable with the economic burden of the Syrians in Turkey, especially with the economy going so bad. Youth unemployment reaching almost 26%, and the inflation rates in double digits. The pressure, the questioning is higher. And Turkey is a polarized society. People do not agree on a lot of issues, but the Syrians in Turkey became a negative island of agreement, regardless of which party they vote for, regardless where they live, regardless of their education and income level. Turkish public has an anti-Syrian attitude, and this is creating a pressure point on government. So for a while, the government officials have been mentioning this. If you look at their discourses, their narration, for a while, this has been going around that Turkey is spending a lot of money and Europe is not being supportive. So it was two things combined, anti-Western attitudes and anti-Syrian attitudes. So it reached a critical point that the government said voluntarily they will not stop people going to the border. And it was a win at domestic level because they managed to score, to show that the refugees are going to leave, they are trying to get rid of them. But they also managed to show that Turkey had moral superiority vis-a-vis the European states because the images were horrible coming from the border. The refugees being gassed, refugees being shot. Ironically, the ministers were criticizing the violence towards civilians by the force or this gassing. I say ironically because when it happens in Turkey, most of the time this thing is ignored. And especially certain applications, certain policies of stripping, taking the clothes and mobiles of the refugees or people and pushing them back to Turkey, the images at the sea were all used to support the narrative that Turkey has a moral superiority by hosting 4 million and Europeans don't want them. So this narrative was very strong and present. And one evidence I can show or anecdote is the Minister of Interior constantly tweeted the number of people crossing to Greece. So it was a signal to show that they are leaving, although the numbers are minuscule.
Özgehan, thank you very much. But in very short, can you tell us, now that President Erdogan has maybe appeased the Turkish public and also has highlighted that the EU, in his own perspective, does not have moral superiority to Turkey, is it mission accomplished, or is there anything else he would like to accomplish, like increasing European assistance to Turkey or bringing the EU, giving the EU a role in Idlib, etc.?
I mean, the political dimension we need to talk, but from a public opinion perspective, it's mission accomplished. From a public opinion perspective, I'm saying, I'm not talking about the real mission. The approval rate of the decision to allow voluntary departures to open the borders was about 70%. There is no other policy issue that receives that much support. So 70% public approval is very important.
That is very important. Özgehan, my next question is, was that the only game plan? or is there more to it? Because the European Union thinks that Erdogan was blackmailing the EU. So what would President Erdogan blackmail the EU into, or towards what end?
I'm not an expert on. No, I'm not an expert on blackmailing, or I don't like these analogies of games and cards and dealing. But the thing is, I tend to focus in the paper as well. I tend to focus on the domestic dimension of it, because what is on the table from Europe in terms of the Turkey-EU relations on a larger scale, there is hardly any possibility to move forward. Upgrading of customs union is not on the table. Visa-free travel for Turkish citizens, it's not on the table. It's very minimal chances of these happening. And on the refugee statement, yes, there have been...
We'll come to the refugee statement. So maybe
okay,
let's move on to Jessica and discuss the refugee statement later. Jessica, if you could unmute. First of all, for everyone, on Sunday, it's Jessica's birthday. So maybe we could give her a virtual applause from now. Happy birthday, Jessica. So Jessica, could you tell us the situation in the European Union, why Greece presented such a firm stance, why the European Union supported Greece in such a strong way? And generally, what does the European public think about this issue?
Sure, Özgür, and thank you for the early birthday wishes, first of all, and for having me join you on this topic. If you ask why did the Greek and EU respond the way it did, then I think it's really important to, from the onset, remember that this overriding mantra of never to let a situation like 2015 happen again was triggered in that moment, right? That in the moment it did catch people off guard, it caught political policymakers off guard in the EU, even though, Özgehan, you're absolutely right, it shouldn't have surprised everyone as much as it did. But then also, of course, the pictures of people being bussed to the border, reminded everyone, of course, of the pictures of what Viktor Orban did in 2015, which actually led to an escalation of the crisis, which didn't have to. So this overarching mantra, not to let 2015 ever happen again, is a big part of the story. On the migration side, maybe just a few figures in the background of what the situation was like in Europe that I think are important. In 2019, for example, asylum applications all over Europe went up again for about 13% for the first time since 2015. This also has to do with a lot of new applications from places like Latin America, right? So there's a bigger migration picture being happening in Europe as well that is not related to the Turkish-Greek border. But of course, the most important thing is that the numbers on the Greek islands and the arrivals were starting to rise again. So it doubled in 1 year from 30,000 to 60,000 people in 2019, and a trend that was still sort of ongoing in the early months. So this was already happening before the Turkish government even announced that it would no longer reinforce the land border or other borders. And then, of course, the Greek islands, the situation on the Greek islands, that has been getting more and more untenable. We have over 40,000 people on the Greek islands. According to the EU-Turkey statement, officially, Greece is not letting anyone off the islands. But so on that sense, you have really a migration picture in the background or the backdrop towards which this Turkish decision happened. On another important factor, on the political scene, you have a new commission who was about or is in the process of negotiating a new pact on migration and asylum that they were going to announce this month. So this sort of threatened to torpedo all of their plans they had in place. And of course, you have a new Greek prime minister, which is willing to do and act in different ways than the previous Greek government. And I think all of these factors, just to keep it short, really explain why Europe and Greece acted the way it did and why it was walking this tightrope of not allowing anything to escalate or taking on a life of its own so that 2015 would not happen again, but also to safeguard still fundamental rights, right? And so I think this really uncomfortable position that the EU was put in explains also the harsh reaction of saying we will not be blackmailed by Turkey. right? This was the first thing. It's because it was also the feeling that it was not only a matter of what, but how. So how the Turkish government reacted and how it escalated it, that was simply not acceptable. But maybe I'll keep it at that for now.
Jessica, I have a few follow-up questions for you. I mean, the way I asked Özgehan what Erdogan's game plan was, what's the game plan for the EU? Like, okay, the EU is not going to be blackmailed by Turkey, but if Turkey decides, you know, in the days that we're all looking forward to after the pandemic, Turkey decides to open the border again. What's the EU's game plan? I mean, is it, let's say, sanctioning Turkey to dissuade Turkey from doing this? Is it fencing the border, you know, or is it basically reaching a new agreement with Turkey?
I mean, if you say what's the game plan, and I mean, the game plan for neither Turkey or the EU can be to continue this type of, I'm going to open the border and exchange for what? We don't know. What is clear is that the EU failed to sort of come up with a post-EU Turkey statement and to communicate clearly that there will be additional support and what that support would look like or could look like. So this is an opportunity the EU did not use, and now, of course, should and will still be interested in finding a common working package and a common basis to operate at the Turkish-Greek borders again, but also concerning the Syrians, but also other migrants in Turkey. So yes, there is a clear interest. I think, again, it's the what or the how. On the diplomatic side, an agreement, I don't know whether it will be reached if there is the perception that there is sort of a bad faith negotiation tactic being played.
Then, you know, let's for both of you, let's all take a couple of minutes to evaluate the statement and action plan which Turkey and the European Union signed back in 2016. Jessica, could you make an evaluation? I mean, in what ways did it work? In what ways did it not work? It has brought down the number of refugees crossing the border dramatically, but others say that the numbers were going down anyway, even without the action plan. So looking retrospectively, how has it worked?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to give sort of just a very brief assessment on a few points where it's clear that it maybe worked, in my opinion, and where it didn't. But just from the outset, on the migration management component of the agreement, there's sort of three separate issues that are all related, but they're not the same. And the one thing is the Syrians actually in Turkey, the Syrians that were displaced, especially during the early parts of the war. The second part is the challenge of mixed migration. And Özgehan, you already alluded to that. And this is the case, of course, in many parts of the world. And that is all these people that are moving for different motivations using the same routes. And the fact that it's not only Syrians, right? It's mainly Afghanis and Pakistanis who are arriving on the Greek islands, still some Syrians, but then also other nationalities from all over the world. And then the third situation, which is the situation in Syria itself, and right now in Idlib. And they're all equally important to explain the situation, I think, in Turkey concerning refugees there. And the EU-Turkey statement of 2016 touched or mainly dealt with the first two. So there was the 6 billion facility promised by the EU, of which 4.7 has been allocated to help Syrians in Turkey itself. There was a return mechanism that was part of this agreement. So saying that third country nationals, not only Syrians, can be sent back to Turkey. And then there was a smaller mechanism within that, the one-to-one mechanism that was supposed to relocate for every Syrian that was returned from the Greek islands, one Syrian resettled to the European Union. And then there were a bunch of visa liberalization, accession chapters, and customs unions. And we can talk about that, which basically didn't go anywhere. But when looking at the migration management components of this, I do think it is safe to say that there are a few things that did work. First of is that the aid did help a lot of Syrians and people in Turkey. And it's, it's also easy to say what didn't work, that the money wasn't spent far enough. This was the largest humanitarian assistance program that the EU has ever financed. So There's a lot of money that did go to healthcare, that did help children go to school. And I do think it's safe to say that that is a success. The numbers of crossings and of deaths did go down significantly. And if you just look at the months before the EU-Turkey statement was signed and then after, it's really difficult to say like the numbers were going down already. You know, there's always like this momentum that was generated back then in 2015 had to be broken somehow, and the EU-Turkey statement did that. And then maybe on the last point, what did not work, or where, when we talk about the future also, that was part of the EU-Turkey statement, and that was supposed to be a functioning and an improvement of the asylum system in Greece and on the European Union level itself, right? So this whole mechanism is based on the fact that countries would resettle people from the Greek islands after they were deemed to be able to receive some form of protection, but also that these would happen very fast. And for 3 years, the Greek authorities have not managed to do so. And this is why you have the humanitarian catastrophe on the Greek islands as well, which is also adding sort of a sense of escalation and urgency to this entire situation. So in that sense, it worked, I think, over the course of that time, but now is the next step and we'll have to adjust.
Thank you very much, Jessica. We'll be talking about the way forward, but I guess in your way forward, this agreement will form the basis for a future solution. Özgehan, I would like to turn to you again. If you could unmute. Now, I remember that in 2016, and it's actually unfortunate that we did not redistribute it during these weeks, you had written another piece for the German Marshall Fund, actually arguing strongly against the EU-Turkey refugee deal from a certain perspective. Could you explain to us what you were trying to tell us back in 2016?
Well, the deal itself, or the statement, the specifics are there more for experts to interpret. But from my point of view, the criticism me and my co-author have raised in the German Marshall Fund piece, the deal to end all deals, is we were criticizing that this was presented and created in a way that was linked with Turkey-EU relations in general. So 2 points were warning signs or red flags for us. One was the refugees and the people in vulnerable situation were made a bargaining chip between Turkey and EU. So rather than working together in terms of partnership, it was put into a game theory perspective. That was something we were criticizing. And second was this optimistic wave that it will create some kind of a positive spillover to Turkey-EU relations, which goes like 5 decades back and which is a much more complex mechanism. The optimists at that time were saying that if Turkey and EU makes a deal with the refugees, regarding the refugees, and it works, people will see that Turkey and EU can work together and it will create a momentum forward. But I was warning the other way around, saying, what if it fails and it will going to poison the other issues that has nothing to do with the refugee issue? Customs union and other legal value-based deals between Turkey and EU under the framework of membership. So by linking the refugee issue, first we turned these people into bargaining chips, and we have been talking about it for the last 3 years. Turkish narrative was EU is not paying the money, and EU was saying Turkey is not doing what it's supposed to do. And on top of it, it poisoned the image of Turkey in Europe and the image of Europe in Turkey. So every other issue we want to talk about now will come back to the refugees. And we can't move forward on Turkey-EU relations on the legal issues, on the values and everything. Just one example would be illustrating. When Turkey is criticized in terms of human rights, the slip of democracy or rule of law, it will immediately respond as, yeah, but we have seen you don't follow these values for outsiders. Look at how you're treating the refugees. We took 3.6 million people, so your values are hypocritic. So this is not a way to move forward, and it poisoned the whole other issues. So if we are going to talk about a spillover, we can talk about a negative spillover.
So Özgehan, this is not the way forward, but we are actually moving closer to the end of the conversation before we start the discussion with the audience. What, in your opinion, is the way forward out of this stalemate?
Okay. First of all, there was also a side effect of this refugee statement between EU and Turkey, which is people didn't foresee it coming, was the number of people apprehended in Turkey. If you look at the statistics, there will be a file to be shared with the participants later on, but it's part of the hyperlinks in my paper as well. In 2019, almost 500,000 irregular migrants were apprehended in Turkey, because Turkey is following the borders much more closer as part of the statement. So Turkey became a pressure point. You know, it's growing now. Before the statement, it was much less people apprehended in Turkey. Now in 2019, it was 500,000 people. So Turkey is attracting people from Africa, Asia, Pakistan, all the way there. And this was a side deal that was not seen. So this kind of reality check must be done. The deal was done in the state of emergency, but now it has to be done based on evidence. However, the move forward is difficult because the trust between two parties is destroyed. Now Turkey has a much more negative image. Oh yes, this is the statistics I was mentioning. Just look how steeply it increased from 2016 to 2019. And this is the official statistics. So to move forward, we need to build trust again. Turkey and EU should find a way to work together. And I find it very difficult under the current economic situation, the pandemic and everything. Just one question for everybody. We don't speak about the coronavirus in Syria, but what if it gets a very, very bad situation, which is very likely because of the health system being collapsed with so many IDPs. It will affect Turkey. First, it will stop voluntary repatriation. The Syrians will not want to go back to a country where there are no hospitals and the disease is there. It will maybe mobilize more people to come to Turkey because they have relatives here and the health system in Turkey is better than Syria. And so we have to talk about the future in this. I see a lot of challenges, but I find it difficult to face these challenges if we don't immediately start building trust between two sides, that it is not a zero-sum game. If it's not Turkey losing, Europe winning, or Turkey winning, Europe losing, it has to be a win-win situation, not only for Turkey and Europe, but for these people in vulnerable situations. Let us not forget, if they could go back, they would go back. If they could stay, they would stay. They are not doing this because they are evil people. They are running away from a war. So we should not forget this humanitarian perspective, but we need to create a positive dialogue and change the narrative. We should not forget that these are real people.
And Özgehan, despite its imperfections, is the action plan still the foundation on the way forward, the foundation of the way forward?
It has to be revised and revisited. And again, I say it has to be revisited based on the evidence and the reality on the field. Jessica rightly pointed out how one-to-one mechanisms and resettlement mechanisms are functioning or not functioning. Just some official statistics again, between 2014 to 2019, in 5 years, only 16,000 Syrians were resettled, got out of Turkey. As part of one-to-one agreement, the Syrians that have been moved is 26,000. So compared with 3.6 million, we're talking minuscule numbers. Plus, there is this pressure of the apprehended irregular migrants in Turkey. As I said, I try to look from a larger EU-Turkey perspective. This is killing EU-Turkey dialogue. We can't talk about customs union. We can't talk about anything else because it's always about this refugee issue. And we have to keep this in mind, how it's going to move forward. But it's again has to be based on equality. Turkey should not be turned into the border guard or bodyguard of Europe protecting against the waves, because that is not going to work. The cost is too high for Turkish government and authorities to play that role.
Thank you, Özgehan. Jessica, if you could unmute. So I'm asking the same question to you. What do you think is the way forward?
I mean, Özgehan was absolutely right. I think there's certain elements that have become clear. They've sounded good in 2016 that have become obsolete. Any type of new basis of cooperating on migration, I think needs to be focused on the migration issues, and also mechanisms like the one-to-one that never worked. There's no point in trying to reinvigorate that going forward. I think given the situation that we're in a pandemic world and what Corona is, I think the most realistic is actually something much shorter term. I don't think we can reach an agreement now for the next 3 years. I think the next year should be focused on making sure the EU commits certain amount of funds to the Syrians in refugee on an ongoing basis, that there is cooperation again on managing the borders for many reasons, but also of course that every effort is done to address the humanitarian situation in Idlib. From what I hear, there's still people trying to cross the Turkish-Syrian border into Syrian-Turkish border into Turkey, and so for many reasons there, and the humanitarian disaster that might come there also with the virus really needs to be addressed. But there's a few things that I think are important to think about when we think about how would such a cooperation look in a year from now, depending on the world that we face, right? And we've all heard sort of the economic impacts and maybe also the health impacts on refugee communities. But it's the first thing is also the financial situation in Europe at the time. I mean, we haven't in Europe agreed upon the new multi-annual financial framework for the EU, which is set to start 21 to 28. This will change completely due to what's happening in Europe right now. The humanitarian and economic situation, what will happen in Turkey, but also in the surrounding countries. We don't know yet how it's going to affect Lebanon, places like Jordan, also with big refugee communities, how Turkey itself will be hit. And so that Turkey's neighborhood basically. And already you have organizations like the UN call for a 2.1 billion funding to address the humanitarian situation worldwide, under which Turkey would be part of a regional program. So I think you can also start to see different areas where it's not only EU, Turkey, but bigger, bringing back the international community back in, because quite frankly, why were we talking about EU and Turkey? It's because it was a failure of the international community to begin with, to end this war and to actually help the refugees, right? So it became this EU-Turkey thing in the absence of international solidarity. So there is also a chance, I think, in all of this that that we can open up this a little bit more and bring it back to this level of trust and helping people, and not to make it just a transactional deal between Europe and Turkey. So maybe these are just some things to think about as we go forward.
Thank you, Jessica. Özgehan, is there anything else you would like to add before we turn to the audience? I
mean, Jessica made a very big, important point that this is not a Turkey-EU issue. As I said, I'm not an expert on refugee issues. I'm a political scientist working on public opinion. Among the audience, there are top-level experts. But I think we should not keep our focus limited to Turkey, Greece, or Greek islands only. This is a global issue, and they have failed to so far to accommodate these people. But now there is a task to what's going to happen in Syria in the future, because how these people will return, will they return, what awaits them if they return are still questions unanswered. And we're not talking enough about the social cohesion programs. We don't talk about integration programs. Just think about the demographics of the Syrians in Turkey. Most of them are under age of 18, and they didn't have adequate amount of schooling. So we have to also consider these issues. This is not a commodity or a box that you are looking for a place to park. These are actual people, and last 5 years they have been going through issues. So we also have to talk about their return, state building in Syria, or cohesion programs in Turkey. The size of the challenge compared with the interventions is very asymmetric. There are very good initiatives in civil society and state international organizations, but it's a little bit like putting a band-aid instead of a surgery. So we have to work together and talk together, start talking right away on the issue. And that's one criticism for the EU as well. I mean, never again 2015, but except for making the statement with Turkey, what happened? Did you revise the Dublin issue? Did you talk with Greece or Italy, or it was securitizing and externalizing this issue? As long as it is in Turkey and Greek islands, it doesn't make Budapest or Prague or Frankfurt safer. It remains. It's just you park them outside. So externalizing the issue was not the way forward. We have to draw lessons from the past.
Thank you very much, Özgehan. Jessica, any last words from you before we start the discussion?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of last thoughts, and that goes to what Özgehan has said on the different migration-related issues. Again, we don't know what the world will look like in a year, and I think we'll have to reevaluate. And so there's this technical migration management component that I do think we need to get right, just in order to stop any situation from escalating and getting worse. But on the longer term things, this is one thing that I know no one in Turkey wants to talk about, but what about the longer term integration of all the children that were born in Turkey? Will that be part of a larger also Turkish plan going forward? And then what I mentioned at the beginning, there's of course the issue of Syrians in Syria and in Turkey, but then there's the mixed migration challenge, which is a structural issue of the migration system worldwide, which we have not found an answer to, right? And so this is something that's what you see in Libya, basically. And without sort of fixing this or moving forward on the international level of finding something like that, that's also something that an agreement between EU and Turkey can not fix permanently, right? There's an underlying structural issue here of the system. So it's also important to be realistic about the expectation what any new agreement or cooperation form can actually bring in which migration area.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Now the floor is open for questions and comments, but the thing is, of course, our floor is also virtual. You see a button that says Q&A. There are already 9 posts there, so 9 questions or comments. I encourage all of you to, if you have any questions or comments, to use this function. I have seen that a couple of people have used the chat function for asking questions, but that doesn't work. So for those of you, if you could move your questions to the Q&A, I think it will be better. So now I'm giving the floor to my colleague Ceylan, who will read the questions aloud for us. Ceylan, what's the first question?
Thank you, Özgür. It's great to connect, though it's virtually. And the first question actually came from Jasper Mortimer because he sent his question through an email before the event. I will just read that out and then go on with the rest of the questions. So the question is as follows. President Erdogan's motives for opening the gates on February 28 remain a mystery, as his move came the day after Turkey lost 34 soldiers in Syria. Some journalists, including myself, thought he sought to push Europe to put pressure on Russia to rein in the Syrian government forces in Idlib. Other journalists thought Erdogan wanted Europe to give Turkey more money for the upkeep of refugees. And some analysts think Erdogan just wanted to distract the Turkish public from the killing of 34 soldiers. When Erdogan and Çavuşoğlu were asked what they wanted from Europe, they gave a list of demands: renewal of the customs union agreement, visa-free travel, etc. But I believe Erdogan had one goal in mind. What do the panelists think about this?
Özgehan, if you could take this question, and if your answer is like all of the above, which were the priority? All of the below.
Well, it's a very comprehensive question, but it's also linked with
you have 45 seconds.
Huh?
You have 45 seconds.
Okay, I can stare at the camera for 45 seconds because this is below. No, but it's also linked with what Ambassador Selim Yenel was asking in other questions I was looking. It was a score in the short term and domestic level. And that's what I say. It made the Europeans look bad, and it gave the illusion that the refugees were being sent. So Turkey is getting rid of this. Short-term domestic gain. For Europe, the issue was the unpopularity of Turkey and unpopularity of President Erdogan. Now he was invited to Brussels right away, and the dialogue jump-started. So this was, some people might argue that this was, otherwise they were trying to ignore the issue and leave Turkey face the consequences of it. But I think it's still too early to pass a judgment if this dialogue is going to move forward or is going to have a positive outcome. The summit was done, videos were taken, but we don't know how to move forward, especially under the current situations. And I think EU has to do some soul searching as well, how they want to handle this issue, how they want to handle Turkey, because the way it's been structured is not working. I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it. That's the thing. So there has to be some soul searching, and there has to be some strategy coming up. And this strategy should not externalize Turkey, but involve Turkey. I'm not saying the Jessica rightly pointed out is okay. I'm back.
You're back, yes.
Yeah. The media images in Europe was how Turkey were busing them, but the media images in Turkey was how the Greek border was pushing them, trying to sink their boats and everything. So we also have to construct a more equal and realistic narrative. I'm not saying Turkey is morally superior or Europeans are morally superior, but that's the narrative, but it's not getting us anywhere.
Thank you, Özgehan. We now have 11 questions or comments. So let's try to keep responses very brief. Ceylan, what's the next question or comment?
Next question is from Menekşe Tokyay, correspondent at Euronews, and she asks, what was the main Turkish calculus by sending refugees to the Greek border, and do you think this move helped Ankara in getting its political objectives with that? From the humanitarian perspective, did it harm Turkey's international image as a country hosting 4 million refugees?
Jessica, could you take this one?
Sure, I can take of course, the second part of the question maybe, because I think it's always important to keep in mind, like Özgehan said, that in both of our media spheres, this played out differently. I mean, of course, also in Europe, there were many critical voices, and these images were terrible, right? That we got also from what the Greek authorities were doing. So it wasn't like it was only a positive image that came out in Europe. But I think the main difference is, again, in terms of that Turkey, and this goes to the second part of the question, if I see that right, that the way Turkey behaved. So there's the what, and there was definitely not enough attention given to the changing situation in Turkey. It was not reported enough in the news in Europe that it was different and that the situation in Turkey had changed as well. And quite frankly, we could see that something like this would be happening a year ago, or I visited Turkey and the Turkish-Syrian border in the summer, and it was very clear that this could not go on like this. But in terms of Turkey losing credibility, I think there's a real risk of, again, sort of, if the only thing is, or that comes out of it, that Turkey is using people and using humans and human lives to sort of get a political objective across. So there's also this a little bit more, or the risk that Turkey is seen more as this cynical and not trustworthy player. So I think there's a real risk of that influencing all negotiations, and as Özgehan said, to the detriment of actually finding a real solution to something that needs to be discussed on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Jessica. Ceylan, what's the next one?
So we have 2 comments and a question from Ambassador Selim Yenel, and I will just read them quickly. The 2 comments are, I cannot agree that Turkey had a moral superiority as it pushed the migrants to such a situation, knowing perfectly well what would happen. Also, do not forget nothing happened to the Bulgarian border. And the next comment is, indeed, we believe that it would help Turkey-EU relations because it was the only opportunity as the relations were not moving at all. Things were progressing, but then Davutoğlu was pushed out and we had a coup attempt. The EU saw it in transactional terms, Turkey in a wider, sorry, my screen is moving, in a wider, I think the comment is now missed. Sorry about that. Anyway, I'll move on with the question. The only thing externally achieved by Turkey was to restart a dialogue, but this is not 2015, and the EU is much more prepared and will not give in to Turkish demands. So what was really achieved other than short-term domestic popularity?
Özgehan, could you take that question?
I mean, I tried to answer it to a degree. Ambassador Yenel has an inside knowledge as well, and very valuable comments in the past on the issue. As I said, on the short term, the goal was domestic, especially a lot of the top brass of the governing party were thinking that the Syrians was one issue that costed them local elections, because a lot of candidates were mentioning the issue, and the Syrian issue was hard to sell even to their grassroots. That's one thing their grassroots are not happy about. You could find anti-Syrian opinion ads in super pro-government newspapers as well. So it was a perfect combination on the short term, anti-Western and anti-Syrian move. And it also was a good video opportunity that Erdogan was invited to Brussels and seen talking to people. Yes, Jessica has a point that Turkey seems to be using the human lives as a bargaining chip, but let's not forget that Europe also seems that they don't care about these.
Thank you, Özgehan.
Lives. So Turkey doesn't care.
Ceylan, what's the next question?
Next one is from Jonathan Katz from GMF. What are the long-term prospects for the refugees in Turkey, given that they are not going back to their homes? EU door is not really open and it's not safe for them to return to Syria, especially as Assad and Putin re-establish control and coronavirus. It seems that the longer-term solution is likely that a majority of refugees will remain in Turkey. What will happen to the refugees in short and in longer term? How will coronavirus impact refugees in Turkey as the Turkish economy collapses and the EU is distracted with internal problems? Thank you.
Özgehan, are you ready to take this one?
I mean, the picture doesn't look very bright because the economy is not doing well. As I said, youth unemployment is there, life expenses, and corona is going to make things even worse. And anti-Syrian attitudes will rise. And I'm very concerned about that issue. There is a political cost for it. I mean, so far the opposition has been careful not to antagonize this issue, but how far it will go. What concerns me is the public opinion. I mean, 80% of the people, based on a recent survey, said that they would not employ a Syrian. So if you give them work permits, that's another issue. 60% of the public believes Syrians are receiving preferential treatment and there's the urban legends against them, and there's the issue of citizenship going around. So we need urgent intervention and cohesion programs, but I don't see them how they can happen, but it requires very strong motivation to do that. But the rhetoric is always they should go back to their homes, but going back to home is difficult. Syria is not a welcoming place for them. So I leave it to the experts on cohesion and refugees, but from public opinion perspective, I am saying that it's very, very bad.
So Özgehan, do I understand it right that although you don't see it likely, integration is the only solution?
Solution to what?
A solution to the crisis. Integration of the refugees in Turkey to the Turkish society, although it's not likely because of the public opinion.
No, baby steps. We should start with cohesion, using the official term, and then move forward. We have to be more honest. That's the problem. We have underestimated the issue. The public were told that they are guests. That's the jargon in Turkey. They are guests. But the moment guest is taking a room and start eating from your fridge, and if you are not shopping, you know, in Turkey, the guest issue is a little bit problematic. The non-Turkish might not know it, but we have a guest room that you don't use normally. And you have guest plates. When they come, you take out the best plates. So it's good for a few days, but if the guest is becoming a flatmate, it starts getting on your nerve that they are taking the big room. And this is not nice. The guest rhetoric should be changed immediately.
Thank you, Özgehan. Ceylan?
The next two questions are actually on this topic, and also they are similar. I will follow. One is from Nora Fisher-Onar, and she also asked how the pandemic may impact EU member states' refugee regime and implication for Turkey. On one hand, there is likely to be a stronger fortress mentality. On the other hand, states like Portugal have been prompted by COVID-19 to give refugee citizenship rights. And also the second one is from Ben Hodges, General Ben Hodges. Thanks to the Turkish people and government for the huge burden they are bearing with this migrant situation. What are the implications of the coronavirus and efforts to contain the virus on the situation? And he also asked another question. Is Turkey getting any international support to handle this situation?
First, let's stick to the coronavirus question. I'll start with Jessica and then turn to Özgehan. So, Jessica, how will the pandemic impact all of this?
Sure,
including the EU's policy, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I did mention a few earlier, so I won't go into them because, of course, also what Europe is dealing with internally right now is huge and will have very big impacts also on the financial packages that the EU will have at its disposal. On the other hand, also see that due to Corona, people in Europe and European policymakers, of course, are not looking only at Turkey and the Middle East, even though that's a really important region, but also what happens in Africa. You know, the EU Commission has just launched a big partnership with Africa, also under migration-related reasons. This is a really important region for Europe. And it still remains to be seen what happens to Corona there. Maybe on the more immediate terms, of course, you have technical issues or more implications is that the entire resettlement and relocation was stopped worldwide. And this will, I don't think, be, you know, reinvigorated for at least another year in full blow. And it remains to be seen how easy it is to sort of do these resettlement programs. And even though we've all agreed sort of that that should be part of any type of agreement with Turkey. And maybe one other thing I'm thinking about, how could funding or European programs together with Turkey in Turkey look like? I think there has to be a rethink and of community-based sponsoring. Now, if Corona hits certain communities, especially those communities maybe where a lot of refugees live, that it's not only money that comes to assistance towards the refugees. I know this has been an issue anyway, some Turkish citizens saying like, why do refugees get all this money from the European Union, right? And so to think in these times, also as the pandemic and the economic situation in Turkey gets worse, of finding different forms of cooperation that has a community-centered approach of dealing with this in terms of fostering infrastructure and for communities more economic opportunities.
Very quickly, health was a sensitive topic that was feeding to anti-Syrian attitudes in Turkey. The public, for instance, was talking about diseases that were eradicated in Turkey, but with the Syrian refugees, they came back. That was the argument. I don't have the scientific background to confirm or reject this, but this is a publicly very much spoken thing, especially children's diseases, because most of the Syrian refugee kids were not vaccinated. So call it an urban legend or whatever, but health was already feeding into anti-Syrian issues. The second was the Syrians getting healthcare. Lots of Turkish citizens were complaining that the Syrians are getting free healthcare when the Turks have to queue up or line up in the hospitals. Now, in this crisis situation, I don't want to imagine a situation where there is a shortage of health personnel or materials, and there will be some rhetoric, there might be some narrative coming up saying Turks should be prioritized, or the Syrians should not be put in ICU, but Turkish citizens should be prioritized. Thank God the common sense will be against it, but I think it's a matter of time. So health and the current crisis can only make things worse in the eyes of the public.
And maybe just a question to my Turkish colleagues, either Özgür or Özgehan. I don't know how far this conversation in Turkey is, but of course in Europe, what you're seeing is many countries fast-tracking either asylum seekers or refugees that work in the healthcare sector in order to get their accreditation going to help in the certain health crisis. And I don't know if Syrian doctors, health personnel that is in Turkey at the moment, if that would be something to consider if that would change the narrative, if that's even conceivable, looking ahead for the next year.
I have seen a few news of the sort on social media, but I don't know how widespread is it. Özgehan, do you have any information?
No, I don't want to. It's not my area. There are people in the audience that know this better. I don't know if they are fast-tracked or if they are employed to be brought in. But yes, if there is a Syrian doctor saving lives, I think that would make a good story.
Well, if there's anyone in the audience who has more specific information, could she or he write this in the question and answer box? Ceylan, what's the next one?
For the sake of time, I will...
I'm sorry. General Hacız had also asked about the international assistance that Turkey is receiving. Özgehan, could you summarize the international assistance Turkey is receiving? Not much.
Again, we should have had an expert on the deal and things. I see Başakkale, my colleague from METU, is answering some questions in QA. Yes, Turkey was receiving financial aid. There was a number of 6 billion euros being spoken. I don't have two things I can talk about it without the things I know. One is how this money is being spent. The procedure was a conflict between the EU and Turkish state. As far as I know, Turkish state wants to use this money under its own discretion, but EU preferred to fund the projects directly. So there is a debate about that, and that is going to be reopened and renegotiated. So how the money is being spent is issue. And again, I can talk about what I know. The narrative, Turkish state has been, President Erdogan included, has been saying that Europe is not paying this money. They kept saying that Turkey has been spending $40 billion. There was this rhetoric of $40 billion, while Europe was not sending the money. Now the European colleagues, the Commission delegation strongly, if you go to the public, they will say,
let's move on with the next question until Özgehan fixes his voice sound.
okay, I think I'm,
Yep.
am I
For
back
the
now?
sake of... Yeah, you are back. Okay.
Özgehan, you're back. And not again. Okay.
No. Okay.
So
for the sake of time, I will just mention that Krishna Deitch and Sonay Kamber also asked about the impacts of the COVID-19. So we will not probably read them in detail, and I will move to the next one. It's again from Jonathan Katz, and he asks, how are Erdogan's political opponents approaching the refugee issue?
Özgehan, are you ready? Özgehan, are you there? Okay. For that question, we will when
Sorry,
Özgehan
I'm
is-
here, but
You're there. Okay,
I'm
good.
here, but I missed the question.
So how does Erdogan's opponents react to the refugee crisis?
They are aware that this is a bipartisan issue that unites the public opinion, but they had the sense and responsibility at top level not to bring up this issue too much. They are not punching on this issue because this is an humanitarian issue. So there is no anti-Syrian party, anti-Syrian electoral commitment. They have been acting very responsible. Only at mayoral level, there were individuals who were criticizing. On the presidential debate, Muharrem İnce once or twice mentioned that he will send the Syrians back if he's elected. But I have to say that on the top level, there's a responsibility and common sense that they are not there's no anti-Syrian public.
Thank you very much, Özgehan. Ceylan, what's the next in line?
Next one is from Amanda Paul, and she asked, can renewed full-scale fighting in Idlib be avoided? If so, how? Or is it a fait accompli? Is there more the EU could do?
Amanda, let me take this one. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks later, we'll have a session on Idlib, but there are now emerging signs that a new battle is emerging on the horizon in Idlib, so it will be difficult to avoid a full-scale war forever. But in 2 weeks, I will have a session on this issue. Ceylan?
The next one is just an answer to the previous questions. And Pınardos says, don't you think the goal can also be attract international attention? And I will move to the next question. This is a comment from Türker Salih. First of all, thank you very much to the panelists. EU-Turkey statement was a success in certain points, as mentioned by the panelists. I agree with that, but there was lots of issues that wasn't addressed in the humanitarian point of view. For example, the EU Special Rapporteur reported in 2017 the concern that the European Union-Turkey statement constitutes a political deal without mandatory value in international law. Its legal basis is undetermined and it cannot be legally challenged in courts. And the next one is a question from Tobias Voge. To what extent are the Turkish authorities still pursuing plans to return Syrian refugees to Syria, including to the so-called safe zone in northeastern Syria? Should this be part of any future deal between the EU and Turkey, and if so, under which conditions?
Özgehan, can you take this question, and maybe you can turn your video off so that your sound will be better.
I did rearrange the settings, but let me know if the sound breaks again. Now, Idlib and Middle East beats me. That's an area I've been staying awake. Ask me about Brussels or Strasbourg, I have more to say. But I think one thing that has to be spoken is this gesture has a consequence. The Turkish public has seen that Europe will not take the Syrians. So Western direction is closed. So the border was opened and they tried to cross. By the way, I've seen a question, so it's linked. What happened to them? They have been, especially after Corona, they have been sent back to urban areas or their settled cities. So some of the camps have been emptied by the border as far as I know. So the Syrians are not going to Europe. That has been seen. If you open the borders, even if people want to go, Europe will not and cannot take them. So the only way to go is east or southeast, Syria. But can they go back to Syria? It still remains a question. So I think the safe zone and all has to be discussed. What will happen in Syria is a wider question, but refugees and the people, the Syrians outside of Syria should not be forgotten when the future of Syria is being designed. It can be safe zone, it can be amnesty, because lots of Syrians in Turkey, the young males, are worried that they will be punished or penalized if they go back. because they have avoided military service. So these have to be taken into consideration when there's the discussion on the future of Syria. Safe zone or other projects, it's beyond me to say. But yes, Turkey and EU have to be engaged, and they have to consider the future of these people when they go back.
Ceylan?
So I think, again, for the sake of time, we will continue with the questions instead of the comments that were directed to the previous conversation. So the next question will be from, let me move on to the, this is one on Russia, and it's from Jonathan Katz. Do you see Russia taking advantage of the growing Turkish domestic tilt against refugees? Is this information largely coming from pro-government media, or is it coming from Russia, RT or Sputnik? Similar disinformation was sown by Kremlin in Europe during the refugee crisis. Putin is a major force behind Syria refugee drive, and then he uses issue to fracture countries internally, split Turkey from West, split Europe internally. Is this understood in Turkey and Europe? For both speakers, thank you.
Does any of the speakers want to respond to this one? Please raise your hand. Özgehan?
No, this is not a Russian manipulation. You have to understand the size of the Syrian presence in Turkey. You don't need Russians to come and spread misinformation. You go to the street and you see the Syrian kids, and you go to the beach and you go to shopping. Just think about the border regions. A population of 80,000 people had a Syrian population of 100,000 people. That is a local reality, and the images were being spread. WhatsApp is much more effective in spreading anti-Syrian attitudes, feeding the anti-Syrian attitudes than Radio Sputnik, because in Turkey, WhatsApp is very commonly used due to people's running away from social media and increasing scrutiny over opposition in social media. So WhatsApp is extremely popular, and the amount of misinformation or hate speech being spread through WhatsApp groups, family groups, work groups is much worse. To be honest, pro-government opposition, whatever, the media has been very careful and sensitive about the Syrian issue. You will not have anti-Syrian preachers or anti-Syrian discussants present on TV. On the contrary, most of the pro-government TV was trying to feed to or push the buttons of the humanitarian issue, the Ansar culture, the religious references. So this is bottom up, and you don't need Russians to intervene. I'm telling you, you go to a hospital, you queue, and you see the Syrians, and people are immediately talking about it. Or a doctor working with Syrians and talking about how many children they are giving. Or somebody reporting that there were 200 Syrian children were born, babies were born in a weekend in a hospital in Izmir. Spreading this around has much more effect. So in short, you don't need Russian intervention because the size is so big that the people have everyday experiences they are sharing.
I see several comments and questions on Idlib, and I would again like to remind you that not next Friday, but the Friday after that, we'll have a specific session on Idlib. Ceylan?
So I will also...
Sorry. Jessica would like to respond as well.
Yeah, no, just on this point, because Jonathan had asked also from the European side, I think in Europe, it's very clear that Russia has a lot to gain from the fact that Turkey and EU have an escalating situation over migrants. You mentioned the images that came to the Turkish TV. I mean, this feeds right into Russia's hands to, you know, start to show, oh, Europe is being really hypocritical on these issues. So from that sense, of course, this is something that has been being discussed in Turkey, where in Europe, sorry, where you have a clear situation that you need the Russians on board to save something where Russia has a clear interest or clearly benefits from certain side effects of the situation, both in Idlib and between EU and Turkey on the refugee issue. So from European side, very important factor.
Thank you, Jessica. By the way, somebody made a joke about the cafe that I'm in. I'm actually not at a cafe. That's where I would like to be at. That's my virtual background. Ceylan?
So I will continue with those whose comments and questions were not voiced before. This is from Selin Peker. She asks, before the municipality elections of 2019, government officials were using Al-Ansar framework for Syrian immigrants and desecuritizing the Syrian immigrants in the eyes of the Turkish public. We observed a transformation on the policy level, started by gathering Syrians from the cities, sending them back to Syria or to the cities they are registered in the summer of 2019. Against these securitizing policies and speech acts, what kind of adaptation policies can be adopted in short and long run on the national and local level?
Özgehan?
Again, this is a more cohesion refugee studies issue, but what would convince public opinion? You see, experience beats narration. So they have an experience with the Syrians, and no matter how the government tries to package it or narrate the story, their everyday experience is beating it. So what we need is more, it starts with acceptance. I mean, we should stop pretending they are going back next 6 months or 1 year. So what we need is to increase people-to-people contacts and bring in the civil society and change it to more partnership rather than charity issues. My experience is with the European issues, and I come from the field, the youth work. So we should not have projects for Syrian youth only. We should start more joint projects that they can work together, and not only targeted at Syrian per se, but to work together projects. So we should focus on, this is one thing on the area I know, the youth. We should get them together, work together, study together, and do things together, environmental projects together. So instead of projects for Syrians only in isolation or education only, joint community projects should be mobilized and civil society should be mobilized. But to move from charity work to integration work. And I think this is one potential area where Turkey and EU or European states can work together, because Germany, France, Nordic countries have years of experience of social cohesion and integration projects. So we can draw on their lessons, best practices, and their failures. So what works and doesn't work, I think Europe has a lot to teach or show or illustrate to Turkey. Teach is a little bit strong, because Turkey is has always been a sending country. So we don't have an experience of hosting refugees or migrants or try to integrate or create cohesion programs. So I think this is an area, and as far as I know, GIZ, for instance, is doing a lot of projects in Turkey in education and other issues. So this is an area of cooperation, but what we need is community and touch people's everyday lives. I've seen that somebody commented about Syrians volunteering in hospitals. That would be a fantastic show to show that these are people not only taking away, but giving to the society a lot. Let's not forget, a lot of Syrians are also being abused in the informal market, and we should also talk about their rights. This narration should change, that they are here laying in the beaches and just sucking on the limited resources. The Syrians are contributing a lot to the Turkish economy. So there has to be a lot of these cases and illustrations. The narration has to be changed.
Well, Berat Cemili and Sonay Kamber have responded to the question on Syrian doctors and health workers. Berat has said, we have had Syrian volunteers from our volunteers, because Berat works closely with the refugee population in Turkey, who wanted to volunteer at the Turkish hospitals. This is what Özgehan was also saying. And Sonay has said, to the question of Syrian doctors, high density of them work at the health centers specifically for Syrians in various provinces. At state hospitals, the number of Syrian doctors should be very limited, since receiving work permits as a doctor is difficult. But this is certainly an issue to be addressed. Ceylan?
So the next question is from Friedrich Püttmann, and he asks, Do you this is actually already mentioned, so northern Syria and the safe zone. So I will move to his next question. Does the topic of culture and religion play any role for Turks increasing rejection of Syrians in Turkey? This is also already mentioned, but
Özgehan, I will again kindly ask you to answer these questions, but maybe you could explain to us in a nutshell what the odds are that a new wave of refugees would come from Idlib to Turkey. Not in too much detail, as we'll have a session on it.
No, Idlib, I will leave to the experts on that thing. I don't know what's going on in the field. I would be pretentious, but if they come, I can say the public will not like it. About the question on this, let me think a little bit, because this is I don't want to just make up an answer, so I'll use my pass now, because Idlib is too complicated.
And we'll come back to you regarding how religion and culture plays a role, and the fact that actually a majority of Turkish citizens and a majority of Syrians actually share their religion.
I mean, I can just use the evidence that when we look at the public opinion polls, the hypothesis many people, especially in Europe, would say, oh, they're Muslims, you're Muslims. It should be easier for the religious people or people with higher levels of religiosity should be more accepting for the Syrians. It doesn't come out like that. The level of religiosity is not affecting the anti-Syrian attitudes. They are sometimes meeting in that because of the economics as well. You have to consider that Sultanbeyli, for instance, is a very good case. There are lots of successful stories there, but these are high level of religiosity, but low socioeconomic classes, which are having issues with sharing the limited resources. So class comes before, economics comes before religiosity. So religious people are not more supportive of the Syrians in Turkey. So that is not an argument. And that I think this is a European misperception that Muslims would be more accommodating for each other. It doesn't work like that. There are other elements, and there's a much deeper underlying issue of Turkish versus Arab debate. If you go to the sayings and issues, there is a strong anti-Arab attitude that existed before the Syrians came. Some people would have nationalistic references to it, how they backstepped, that's the narrative. During the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabs have backstepped the Turks by declaring the independence, so this Muslim issue didn't work. And just think about the sayings, you can find lots of old proverbs, which are very almost hate speech about Arabs. So before this issue of religion comes the nationality. So I would put nationality or nationalism and economics before religion when I'm analyzing the Syrian attitudes.
As a matter of fact, Özgehan, am I correct when I say that actually there is an element of nationalism in Turkish Islamism, and actually there is an element of religiosity in Turkish nationalism as well? They go hand in hand. So if there was a prevailing Turkish Islamism that had no element of nationalism, it could have been easier. But on the other hand, we have nothing to compare with. Imagine if we had refugees from a non-Muslim country, 3.6 million refugees from a country with a different religion and culture. It could have been more difficult. Could it not? We don't know. Okay, Ceylan.
Next one is from Başakkale. The EU-Turkey deal, despite the criticisms on the moral grounds, have worked from a practical perspective as the visa liberalization was going to happen. And she made reference to Ambassador Yenal that he can explain further. And then continues, Syrian livelihoods were strengthened. That's why Syrians were not leaving Turkey when the border was open. If there was no coup attempt in 2016 summer, do you think the deal would have been more focused on the other aspects of EU-Turkey relations?
Jessica, maybe you could respond to this question, but let me paraphrase the question as such. If the democratic backslide in Turkey had not happened in the aftermath of the failed coup attempt in 2016, could the other aspects of the agreement, such as visa liberalization or customs union modernization, etc., could they have been activated?
I'm not an EU legal accession expert, so I'm going to also venture away from those type of technical questions. If you're asking, though, what has come up again and again is on the situation of trust between the EU and Turkey and the basis and the level of cooperation that we needed for the agreement. I do think that 2016, I know it's been said it was unrealistic, all these extra visa liberalization things, but I think for many people negotiating the deal at the time, it was actually meant in good faith with a strong view and clear view that this might actually be a good thing, and that with little inches and increments through this cooperation, we're working together on a humanitarian situation. Plus, look, we're opening up new visa channels for Turkish citizens. Let this be the basis of a new relationship. I do think that was genuine by a lot of people actually involved in making this agreement. And so, I mean, can't predict the future of what would have been without the coup attempt, but I do think it has sort of put the entire relationship, again, of putting all those issues together, has made that even more clear that that is not a basis of going forward right now when talking about the refugee issue.
Well, I mean, if I may step out of my shoes as a moderator, I think that this is the problem of mixing together a normative process or normative processes with a transactional process. Because, of course, one expects as the transactional process goes ahead, the normative process should as well, but it has its own dynamics, and the failed coup attempt made it very difficult for the normative process to proceed. Ceylan?
Next question is again for Jasper Mortimer, and this is specific for Jessica. When Erdogan asked the EU to contribute to the costs of building a safe zone in northern Syria, the Europeans refused because it saw that resettling Syrian Arabs in the northeast would change the demography of that part of Syria, where the Kurds were heavily represented. If Erdogan were to ask the EU to contribute to the costs of building a safe zone in Idlib, when a change of demography would not be an issue, would the Europeans respond positively?
I mean, there's sort of two parts to this question. And the first thing is, has the situation changed now in the minds of Europeans than it was last fall, for example? And people may remember the defense minister, German defense minister, AKK, when she proposed maybe we should be serious about a safe zone, she was ridiculed in large parts of the German public press and everything. I think now such a proposal would look very differently, to be honest. So I think there's sort of this general concept of having a humanitarian safe zone in northern Syria that the discussion you can have on the European level is different. What has not changed is sort of the calls, and this has been, but Özgür knows this better, on this military component to what a safe zone would look like and who would enforce that. And that has sort of been unclear from the get-go from the European level. Certainly Europe would not be willing to make a contribution militarily on that area. But I do think, and now especially due to the big fear and the likelihood that the coronavirus is likely to hit the big populations that are displaced in northern Syria right now in Idlib, there is a clear humanitarian need also to push this forward and to bring just help into that area. And that would have to be some sort of humanitarian safe zone.
Ceylan, I see that we have 7 more minutes. So could you maybe combine a couple of questions?
Sure. I just realized that I had received questions from Ellen Makowski from my email, and I will just read them out. How do you explain the apparent fact that Syrians at the Idlib border are not crossing into Turkey? Can you describe Turkey's border regime? And the second one is, I was told by a Turkish Ministry of Education official some months ago that 99% of Syrian refugee students are now in the Turkish public school system. Any sense of how this is working out? How are Turkish parents reacting to this, crowded classrooms, etc.?
Ellen, these are very bright and very specific questions. I hope Özgehan can answer them.
Idlib question, I will leave it to the discussion on Idlib. What is the border control? What are the consequences? About education, yes, there are Syrian kids in the schools, but so far it's not being discussed so much. But there were some, again, anecdotal evidence I have, because as I said, I don't work on the Syrian part, I work on the Turkish public opinion. Most of these kids are fluent in Turkish. They were born and raised here. And unless they say they are Syrians, you wouldn't know. So there was this wonderful documentary that some of them had anti-Syrian attitude, saying they are coming and making the classes bigger, but they were from Syria themselves. But they've been there for a longer time. So far in education side, it's not being discussed. This is not an issue that Syrian kids are overpopulating the schools and everything. As I said, health was being discussed, the diseases were being discussed, employment, economic benefits, citizenship, voting, housing were discussed, but education was not a hot issue. I mean, I might be wrong, I might have missed it, but in the eyes of public, it was more on economics and other issues.
Ceylan?
We don't have any open questions that were not mentioned before, but we have a comment from Danya Hatip that she mentions the NATO contribution to Turkey to push Assad. So this is a comment. And also another one from Başak Kale that we haven't mentioned before, that there are mechanisms that are being developed for skilled refugees to be settled in classical resettlement countries, but they are not going to be settled as refugees but migrants. This is in the pipeline where procedures are not clear yet. It will be important to see how host countries will be willing to let their skilled refugees to leave.
Thank you, Ceylan. And maybe this is the right time to wrap up the discussion. Let me thank everyone who has bared with us. And let me inform you that this was actually the first one in a series of virtual events that we will be hosting on Turkey. And you know how it will work is we'll be combining it with our own Turkey series, which is a series on an ongoing series of opinion briefs on Turkey written by experts on the ground in Turkey. So you may have recognized that yesterday we just released another analysis on how the pandemic is impacting political polarization in Turkey. So that's what we will be discussing next Friday with Emre Erdoğan. And the Friday after that will be a discussion on Idlib following a paper by Şaban Kardeş on what's going on in Idlib right now. And you know, if you have, let's say, ideas on how we could make this better, or ideas on what issues we should cover, please let us know by email or by any other way. We'll make sure to integrate them. Thank you very much, and let me thank all of my colleagues, those that you can see and others that you cannot see, that have been helping us behind the virtual curtain. And let me thank all of you for being with us. And I wish all of you the best in these difficult days. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Özgür.